Bob's next in Tyler, Texas, a Republican caller. Bob, you are talking to Lauren Leader. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I believe that all men and women should be given the opportunity to vote. But I believe that those who do not know our laws should not be given that opportunity until they know and that we are a republic and not a democracy. Anybody that thinks we are a democracy does not know enough about our law and should not be given the chance to vote. And in that regard, September 17th is Constitution Week. Every school in America is to hold a program on the Constitution. That's where we can learn the difference between a republic, a guaranteed Republican form, and a democracy, which is chaos. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Well, listen, so I don't totally agree, but that's okay. Look, I am a believer that Americans need to learn civics. And it's actually a huge part of what we do at All In Together is that we teach core civics to adults, because once people are out of school, they don't often have that opportunity. About 70% of Americans could not pass the citizenship test that is required in order for someone to become a naturalized citizen. And I find that really heartbreaking. You know, I don't agree with having any kind of litmus test for voting, so I disagree with that. But I do think, you know, we have a real civics crisis in this country. Americans don't understand our system, and they don't understand how it works, and they don't understand even just some basics about the equal branches, equal powers of the three branches of government. So, you know, 70% of Americans couldn't name a single person that represents them in elected office. Most Americans would fail the citizenship test. I would love to see that become a national movement, and that we really encourage everyone to take the citizenship test to learn the basics of how our system works. It's what we try to do in our programs. We love programs like Civics, which was founded by Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, which is a very intensive civics program that tries to expand civics education in public schools across the country. But there's no question, kids are not learning some really basic things, and most Americans just don't know them. And it's very hard to make up that ground in adulthood.
Let's talk about tariffs, Lauren Leader, because you have written that the president's tariff policies will impact women. How so?
So it's important to understand that women are already the majority of Americans in poverty. The majority of people on public assistance, the majority of the Americans that are living below the poverty line, excuse me, are women and children, many of whom are working. And there are a number of sort of exacerbating factors. You know, one is that a lot of the lowest wage jobs are jobs that disproportionately employ women. So service workers, hospitality, care, all of those fields are very badly paid and disproportionately held by women. And then the second piece is that women already, before tariffs, setting that aside, already pay kind of it's jokingly called the pink tax, which is that products and services that are marketed towards women are often priced up. So you can have two razors. You can go check it at CVS. You can have two razors. It's called the pink tax because it's there's a pink razor and there's a blue razor. The men's razor is a third of 30% less of a price than the women's razor, which is marketed to women. And also women have more needs in terms of what they need to purchase. Menstrual products, for instance. Women are the ones who do most of the diaper buying and formula buying. So all of those things, women have higher costs. They're making less money to begin with. And so when you look at then the impact of tariffs, which, is heavily going to affect, it's affecting almost every product and service soon, from cars to, household goods. But because women are already at a disadvantage, every incremental increase in expense for them, can drive them further into poverty. So, tariffs are going to affect all Americans. We're going to start to see that soon. I hope that the impact will be blunted. I would not wish this on anybody because Americans are already struggling with the cost of living. But there's no question that, it will be worse, for those who are at the lowest income levels, and that is primarily women.
Kathy is in Kansas, Democratic caller.
Hi.
Morning, Kathy.
Good morning. I just wanted to make a comment on how do you expect America to, when they have a leader like we have in charge who is so misogynistic, who's been caught on tape saying it's okay to grab women's groin area. He's been found guilty of rape and sexual molestation. He's committed adultery on all three of his wives. And then we have the Hegsets in the office. And then we have Don Jr. I don't know. I saw it briefly, and then they never showed it again. When Trump was on the roof of the House, Don Jr. AIs this thing and posted of Trump throwing, after all this happened with the NBA, women in the WNBA, and people throwing sex toys out on the court. And then you have Don Jr. showing Donald Trump on the roof with a superimposed dildo he's throwing off. And then people admire this. This type of acting is admired by men and praised and laughed about. How are women ever going to win? How is this country ever going to come out ahead with that type of mental attitude amongst men?
All right, Lauren Leader.
I mean, listen, I have a lot of concerns about what's happening for men and boys in this country and the, glorification of kind of an ultra macho, misogynistic culture. I'm very worried about it. I've been worried about it for a long time. I was frankly worried about it before Trump. This is, I don't have any doubt that, the sort of coarseness that you've already summarized a lot of the issues, has an effect on American culture. I think we all appreciate that and understand it. But we've had some crises in this country around men and boys for a long time. I mean, part of it is the conditions under which we get to a place where so many Americans are kind of fine with stuff that, would have been disqualifying. I mean, it's so funny because you think about someone like a Gary Hart, who had an affair and immediately dropped out of the race. There were years, for most of my lifetime, there were these standards that if you were, not considered to be, ethically inscrutable, that you couldn't run for public office. And obviously that's changed. So look, I think I'm very worried about those things. I also, though, I got to tell you, I'm kind of obsessed with Travis and Taylor, not to get off on a, super internet-y, clicky subject, but, you've got as much for all the Donald Trumps, just think about the adulation of Travis Kelce. And I love him because he is so unthreatened and so respectful of Taylor, who is an absolute superstar, who, is a much bigger deal than he is, much richer than he is. And he's totally unthreatened by her. And she has been a very active voice on, women's rights and in politics. And, he is right there to support her. And so I'm kind of hopeful that actually there's going to be this Travis Kelceization of some of the culture, that people will want to emulate him more than maybe some of the other horrible behavior that we see going around. Call me naive, but I'm kind of psyched about them for no other reason than that. Also, because they're so cute.
All right, Lauren Leader, you just took C-SPAN for a twist there.
Hey, you can't go 5 minutes without bringing up But I had a very well-considered feminist argument for why I love Travis Kelce.
All right. We'll go to Jacqueline in East Elmhurst, New York. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call, and I'm sorry if I'm a little nervous. As someone who is Republican and I lean right, this is first just an opinion. There is no way, at least in my opinion, that I think that Republican women would ever support limiting our vote as women. I just think that that's never going to happen. My second kind of a point and just sort of a question is regarding the transgender movement and your organization, or maybe women's organizations in general. I feel like it's been a step back for women in many respects, because I think even Gloria Steinem in the 70s. I mean, I can't imagine that the support for people who identify as trans women would have been looked at as really being women. So I feel like that has really hurt the women's movement in a way.
Yeah, Jacqueline, let's take your point.
Yeah. So thanks for that. It is really complicated. I struggle with it, to be honest. I struggle with it because it is such a polarizing issue and because it has created some real problems for the Democrats, the sense that, this tiny, tiny, tiny minority of Americans, that their rights, have become so central. And so I do struggle with that. And I struggle a bit with the trans women in sports issue. I do relate to why people are so incensed about that. On the other hand, I do believe in treating all people with dignity and respect and giving them, all people deserve full rights. And if I don't believe that I have the right to impede on anyone else's freedoms. And it pains me terribly to see the persecution, of any group in this country. And, trans people have a pretty hard road to hoe right now. So, I do understand why it's really complicated. And look, I went to a women's college and, in the time that I was there were, huge debates about whether or not trans women should be allowed in women's colleges. A lot of the women's colleges really struggled with that. So it's an ongoing issue. On the other hand, I have friends who have trans kids. You just want these people to feel loved and respected as humans. And anything that does anything to erode that, to me, feels wrong. My last point is you're completely right about the 19th Amendment. I don't think there's any chance that the 19th Amendment will be repealed. First of all, we have an extremely high bar to changing the American Constitution. We make it very hard. In fact, we have fewer amendments to our Constitution than almost any other Western nation. That's how hard we make it. Other countries have 3-4 times as many amendments as we do. So I'm not saying that I think we're changing it, but I do worry that there's anyone out there that thinks it's acceptable, to marginalize, to sort of glorify marginalizing women's rights that way. It's just such a fundamental. And I think it's worth understanding because it's an undercurrent and it may not be representative. I think most Americans would never agree, but it is distressing that also people in very high positions of power, like a Pete Hegseth, think that's an acceptable point of view. I mean, I worry very much about him being in power. In running a military that relies enormously on women. And by the way, transgender service members who, we have an all-volunteer military that has been extraordinarily high performing, even with, and maybe especially because of, its embrace of diversity and inclusion, the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the embrace of transgender service people. It is the most, meritocratic organization out there. If you can't make it, you can't make it. And so repealing expelling, honorable transgender service people just seems to me blatantly discriminatory and frankly undermines the strength of our military. So anyway, I could keep going on that, but I won't.
All right. Well, we're out of time. Lauren Leader, who's the co-founder and CEO of All In Together. The website is aitogether.org. Lauren Leader, thank you for the conversation.
Thanks. It was great. And thanks to all the callers.